Hello and welcome to the Author Talk webinar series brought to you by the Master of Arts in Writing and Master of Arts in Science Writing programs and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with author Vicki Valosik on her new book, Swimming Pretty: The Untold Story of Women in Water. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Author Talk playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of tonight's event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Melissa Hendricks, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Arts in Science Writing program.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening, everybody. I am so delighted to be here. It's a special thrill for me because I do remember talking to Vicki maybe a decade ago, maybe more, about this book when it was just maybe a little thought bubble. And I could not be happier to see it actually now in print. And I'm also delighted to introduce our guest moderator this evening, Sue Eisenfeld, who has taught in the MA in Writing and MA in Science Writing programs for more than a decade and is a 2009 graduate of the writing program. Sue's essays have been listed 6 times among the notable essays of the year in Best American Essays and have been published in numerous literary journals. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Smithsonian, The Forward, and many other magazines. And she is the author of 2 books, Shenandoah, A Story of Conservation and Betrayal, and Wandering Dixie, Dispatches from the Lost Jewish South. And we're kind of coming full circle here because Sue was also Vicki's instructor way back when the book was that little thought bubble. So I'm delighted to introduce Sue, who will lead our discussion.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And thanks for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here with Vicki. I was just going to say, I love that it's coming full circle. Vicki was in my literary travel writing class in 2012, and she's a 2013 graduate of the writing program. So we've known each other a long time, and it's been really delightful to see your career grow. So I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you tonight. I'm just going to do a little intro so everyone knows a little bit about you. Vicki Valosik is a writer, a master synchronized swimmer, and an editorial director and writing instructor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Swimming Pretty is her first book, and her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Smithsonian, Slate, American Scholar, U.S. News and World Report, Huffington Post, Washington Post Magazine, Philadelphia Inquirer, and on and on. She has gotten amazing press for this book this year. Reviews and articles in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, the Atlantic, Good Housekeeping, Town and Country, Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. And just the other day, her book was recently named a staff pick on NPR's Books We Love for 2024. So congratulations on all the fabulous press. Today we're going to talk about the book, but I also want to talk with you about the process of writing the book, and in particular, how your Hopkins experience was preparation for writing this book. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sue. And Sue didn't mention she was also my thesis advisor at Johns Hopkins. So she was really instrumental in developing me as a writer, and as was the Hopkins program. And I'm just really delighted to be here. And thank you to all of the organizers and to Sue for moderating.
All right, well, let's just dive in. I did read the book. I read the whole book, and it was an amazing book. And one of the things I thought was so interesting about it is you think it's going to be the history of women in water, like it says, but it's also the history of swimming in general It's the history of women in sports and physical education. It covers swimming witch trials. It's the history of variety shows, vaudeville, novelty acts, pageants, carnivals, aquatic spectacles, women's bathing suits, drowning and life-saving. It gets into women's suffrage, movement for racial equality, and Olympic history. So it's huge, it's multifaceted. And I guess my first question for you is, what was your goal in writing this book?
Hmm. My goal changed a lot over time. At first, the very, very beginning, it was just to do a history of synchronized swimming, the sport that I had discovered and changed my life and that I loved. But then as I was researching, I realized that the threads it just was connected to so many things. As you mentioned, history, physical education, women's empowerment through sports, even suffrage, and not to mention all the different performance genres of the circus and vaudeville and film. So I just for many years, actually, I was a bit confused about what is this book. It's no longer a history of synchronized swimming, but to call it a history of women's swimming was too broad because it had this performance focus. So ultimately, my goal became to just show how this performative style of swimming was empowering for women and gave them an entry point into the world of sport. And then from there to say, here's how the sport evolved along with other social currents of the times through the decades, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think you succeeded in pulling all those threads together, which is amazing. So I hope this doesn't sound snarky, but if I had to summarize one of the themes I came away with most, it's that it's sort of a history of men not letting women swim, establishing rules for making it hard for women to swim and even dangerous, women forging ahead anyway, and then the history of men profiting off of women swimming. Is this like a legit theme of the book that I came away with?
I think so. But then also I would add to that, like the history of women pushing back against all of that and the history of women doing things on their own terms and the history of the strong women who changed all of that, like one step at a time. But absolutely, you're right. There are such strong themes of as women are trying to be empowered, it's why did they need to be empowered? Because they were being held back. So definitely. And some of the male sports journalists still make my blood boil when I read their quotes, like Paul Gallico. But yes, I agree. But yeah, as I said, I just add to that the history of the women pushing back against all of that.
Absolutely. Another thing that really emerged for me is that synchro involves looking pretty in a lot of its history, but it's a damn hard sport. Can you talk about whether that was a message you were going after too in presenting this history?
Yes. Yeah, I definitely wanted to portray the difficulty of the sport, particularly today. I mean, it did go through eras where it wasn't very difficult. It was a lot of pageantry. So I wanted to be fair to show there was definitely a show business history to it, but to show how much it has evolved and to try to show what it has become today, how, it owes a lot to this past of show business and pageantry and water pageants, but it's a very difficult beast today, and so I was trying to show that, to try to show both sides, to be fair. I wanted the athletes reading it today to recognize the sport that they do while being, true to its actual history.
Yeah. Now, your website says that your first connection to synchro was profiling a synchro swimmer who invited you to a team practice, and you said you knew immediately that you had found your people. Can you tell us about that experience and how it influenced your writing and your thoughts on whether you really have to have a personal connection like that to be able to write a book like this well?
Sure. So I first got into synchro through a class at the Rockville Pool, and it kind of happened simultaneously. I was in the Hopkins program at the time, and my boss at the time sort of encouraged me to take this class, and I write about that in the prologue, how I was she just really encouraged me. We were talking about something that sounded fun. I said synchro sounds fun. found a class, I took it, and I was in the Hopkins program I was in Tim Wendell's class actually, and I was supposed to write a profile on someone. And there was a retired opera singer who had for many years competed on the master's team that I later became a part of in the class. And so I asked her if I could profile her, and she kindly agreed. And so that was the assignment I did. And then it ended up being published in the Washingtonian. And then she invited me. She was still a little bit involved with the team, invited me to a practice, and she ended up actually becoming my first duet partner at my very first competition ever. So it was interesting because she was in her 70s. I was in my 30s, and the way it works is they average your ages. And so we competed in the 50s age group, which was nowhere near either one of our ages. But then your second question about, do you need a personal connection? I don't know that you have to have it, but for me, it definitely was instrumental in a lot of it. Was the sort of the personal drive and interest that motivated my research. I don't think I would have ever found the research as interesting as I did if I wasn't involved in it. It also gave me access because it's a sport that, isn't always taken seriously. It's made fun of at times. So to, contact someone who's in the sport, ask for an interview, and to know that I'm a synchronized swimmer myself, they were much more willing to speak with me. And then also even just some fun things like seeing, descriptions of moves from the 1800s or early 20th century and recognizing it like, oh, that move is now called the ballet leg or whatever. So that was fun, which I wouldn't have had if I didn't do the sport myself as well.
Yeah. So if my memory serves me right, you wrote some short pieces about synchro in various national magazines. And is that how you got discovered by an agent? Can you retell us the story of how it happened for you that this book came to be?
Absolutely. So I was during the 2016 Olympics trying to write all I could because, it's basically people think about synchronized swimming once every 4 years when the Olympics came around. So I wrote a few pieces that got published, and then thinking at the time, oh, I'll certainly be done with this book by the 2020 Olympics. And then nowhere near being done when the 2020 Olympics came around. But I published an article. Of course, they were postponed to 2021 anyways, but I published an article about the name change of the sport. So synchronized swimming was changed to artistic swimming officially in 2017. And it was a big controversy around the name change because it was not, the athletes didn't want it. It came from higher ups in the world of sports management. So I wrote an article about that. It was published in the Atlantic, and an editor there saw the article, saw in my bio that I was working on a book, and reached out to me. And I did have a book proposal ready because I had been thinking of working with University Press, and I had already sort of had that out in the world. So I sent her my proposal, and they offered me a contract. So then I was from there trying to figure out, do I need an agent or not? So the process for me was a little bit backwards. So I got the editor first and then the agent, but that's how it happened.
Okay. And so you'd been collecting all this material for your articles and for a book, but when did you really realize that like you had enough material there, you had enough interest, this was really a project you wanted to undertake, and it was really a book?
I think I knew I had enough material for a book at least 5 or 6 years ago. But I still kept collecting material because the research was really enjoyable. I just enjoyed that process a lot. And it wasn't really until I had my chapters sort of outlined, like that I could sort of hold the whole book in my head at once and know here's, have sort of buckets for my ideas to go in. And that really came once I started putting it into chapters. And that's when I sort of slowed down with the research, or at least became more targeted of like, oh, okay, I have plenty on this, but now if I'm going to have a whole chapter on diving girls, for example, I need to do a lot more research. So it came pretty early that I knew I knew I wanted to do a book, but I still was researching for many years.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your research, like how and where did you do your research, and did you have to travel, and like how many interviews did you do? And just give us a sense of, like, this is a massive book. It has so much in it. What does it take to do a book like this?
So my research, because it covers a lot of different time periods and different genres of performance and sport, I have a lot of different kinds of sources. So I did do a lot of interviews for the later chapters of well, even the epilogue, like current athletes, but then for the last chapter, some of the women who were in the very, very first international competitions and helped spreading the sport in the 50s and 60s. But then, I also had sources dating back to the 1600s. So I'm using, the free, all of the many free things like Internet Archive where you can find these things. And then everything in between, one of the chapters that talks a lot about the connection to women's physical education history. I used a lot of physical education journals to know like what were physical educators reading and talking about amongst themselves. So there were, and then also I did visit several different archives. I visited the International Swimming Hall of Fame 3 different times. My husband came on 2 of those trips, and we just took pictures. And the way that happened was actually quite funny because when I first started thinking, I think I want to do a book, and I was reading, secondary sources, and I kept seeing references to the International Swimming Hall of Fame and things coming from their archives. So I reached out to them and I said, hey, if I wanted to at some point come to your archives, what would I need to do? And they said, well, you better come now because we are packing up our archives. We're going to be moving across the country and they're going to be inaccessible for 5 or 6 years. So, so I booked it down to Florida. And that's why we were just taking pictures of everything because I didn't even at that time know yet what I was looking for. I was just I was still in the sort of exploratory phase of the research. So took pictures of, aquacades, programs, people's, they have a really rich collection of scrapbooks and personal journals and things from performers and swimmers from even the turn of the century, like the 1910s. So all of that turned out to be really useful. Some things that I thought I would use, I didn't. Some things that I thought, oh, I'll take a picture just in case, ended up being really critical because I just didn't know at the time.
I'm curious to know, like what percentage of all the materials you researched and everything you collected, what percentage of it do you think made its way into the book?
Oh, that's a great question. Maybe 15, 20%.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about 10% for one of my books was what I figured. And I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are on like doing so much of that research and then only using a small percentage. Like that's just naturally the way it happens, right? Or, what are your thoughts about that?
I think in my case that it shaped the book even when it didn't shape it in terms of like this is something that gets cited, just sort of shaping my ideas and realizing, oh, this is a bigger story or this has connections to these other areas, and just thinking about like the women's empowerment angle or things. So I feel like the sort of the broad net of research just shaped what the book became. Even when it didn't shape it like at the page or sentence or citation level. So I think I had to do it, even though at times I was really overwhelmed by the amount of research I had. And I think that's the reason it took me so long was just kind of I was learning how to write a book as I was writing a book and learning how to research a book and how to organize the research. So I probably did do more research than I needed, but I don't think it would be the same book if I hadn't either.
Yeah.
Time, you know what I mean?
And how many years did it take you to write this book from beginning to end, would you say?
I started researching it close to 10 years ago. I'd say 8 or 9 years ago. But I
Okay.
didn't really start writing until I got the contract. My book proposal only included articles I didn't have a sample chapter. So once I got the contract, I had to write the whole book in a year, which was the most stressful, difficult year ever of my whole life. But when I'd say I was working on it, close to a decade, it was really just, researching it. Oh, I'm enjoying the research. I'm finding out these things. I'm writing some articles here and there, but the actual sitting down and really writing was like a year and then another half year for revisions.
Wow. That's incredible. Okay, well, I want to dig in a little deeper. I'm going to eventually come back to the characters in the book. Don't worry, because I know some of them are colorful and I want to hear about them. But I want to just stay on this theme of like how you wrote the book and what it's like for a real author to like go through this for real. Can you talk a little about how you organized the book or how you made the decisions about how to organize the book, I guess? Like, how did you decide on chapters, what goes where with such a great amount of material?
That, in a way, I feel like if you're doing a survey history, you have chronology and you have themes. Those are like the two major ways to do it. And in my case, I was lucky that those two aligned to some extent, because or at least starting to, I was kind of thinking chronologically, and then I started to realize, well, my chronology actually works with this style, this era of performance. Vaudeville, for example, can be a chapter, or now we're moving into cinema, so that can be a chapter. So in a way, it worked, or physical education, women getting into sports, or even the earliest chapter when it was just men doing it and they were exploring what the body could do in the water. And I called that science, the science chapter, because they were approaching swimming scientifically. So I think just the fact that these sort of eras and types of styles of swimming and venues in which people were swimming worked for me, that it was chronological. But then I think what was really difficult was where there were themes that overlapped and they were in multiple chapters. So, for example, suffrage, there were several different chapters that were taking place in the era of the 1910s, early 1920s, where, the movement for suffrage, or the new, women newly having gained the suffrage, was really instrumental. So deciding which chapter really gets the bulk of that, because it might not necessarily be the first time suffrage is mentioned, might not be the best place to really, dig into it. So I think that was one of the hardest parts of just figuring out, when things weren't neat and tidy in terms of the chronology, like where to put them.
Did you have a spreadsheet or how did you manage the design of the book in this way?
I am just a pen and paper person. I mean, I actually, like, I would have piles and piles of papers. In fact, my editor at one point, she said she envisioned me like sleeping at night on piles of papers. Every time she met with me and she could see my desk was covered. No, I did try spreadsheets and things, but I just ended up being very analog. Word documents, putting lists on paper and then moving into Word so I could have them later, was just ended up being the way I worked best, even though it might not have been the most efficient.
Yeah, well, that happens.
Yeah.
So I do want to go back to the characters. There are a lot of interesting characters, and I wondered if you might talk about one of your favorite people.
Definitely Annette Kellerman. Sorry, I've got a cat here. This is Bojangles. I didn't close the door because I knew he would meow at the door if I closed it. Annette Kellerman for sure was one of my absolute favorite, because she was just doing, she, for those who don't know, was a variety theater, vaudeville era performer. She started out as an endurance swimmer. She was from Australia, and became the most highest paid and most famous vaudeville performer in the US, and then became the first aquatic stunt woman of the silent movie era. And she was doing things like jumping, diving off of cliffs, diving with her hands bound, swimming with alligators. I mean, it was just incredible the things she did. But she was an incredible advocate too for women to swim. A key thing that she's actually the most known for really was the way that she revolutionized women's swimwear. So, and when she was getting started, they were still wearing the bathing costumes that took 7 to 9 yards of fabric, often wool, weighed up to 30 pounds when saturated with water. So just incredibly dangerous. So she was convinced that, well, women are not athletes in the water because of what they're being forced to wear. And she, created this suit that was basically like a leotard with tights sewn onto it, and widely advocated for women to wear that. It gave them freedom of movement. It weighed 2 ounces. So those started to be mass produced by knitting factories all over the US. And that was really instrumental for women, really, to have this sort of advocate for them. She was also an advocate of just sort of being physically active as women were coming out of the Victorian era. So she was a definite favorite for me.
I know you have another favorite too. Dare I say that another favorite is Commodore Longfellow?
Oh, that's so funny. You read my mind. I love Commodore Longfellow.
Can you tell us a little bit about him too?
Yes, Commodore Longfellow is very dear to my heart. And actually my editor too, she would just write in the margins, I love him. And I was like, yay, I achieved what I was hoping to achieve. So he was the founder of the American Red Cross water safety and swimming program in 1914. And he's in my book because he had this very unique approach to teaching people about swimming. He just had this larger than life personality. He loved to entertain. And so he came up with this idea of the water pageant, which was a play that was just performed in the water, lakes, rivers, ocean fronts, camps, schools, swimming pools. So they had these take-home messages about the importance of water safety. They had, dramatic dialogue and costumes. So it might be, for example, some pirates that, row onto the scene in their canoe. They're deathly afraid of falling in the water because they can't swim. And then they see these water nymphs like cavorting beautifully, doing what we would call like early forms of synchronized swimming and saying, oh, well, swimming can be beautiful. It doesn't have to be terrifying. So then they get in the water, they learn how to swim. So the audience is watching this and then, learning about, different life-saving methods or different swimming strokes and taking home these messages. But I also love Longfellow because he was such a feminist when that wasn't even a word yet. When the American Red Cross refused to allow women into this brand new program he was establishing, he said, fine, I'm just going to make a sister organization called the Women's Alliance. And it used all of the same life-saving lesson plan certification. And he certified thousands of female lifeguards through this sister organization. It was completely unofficial. He wasn't getting paid for it. And then when the American Red Cross, the same year women got the suffrage in 1920, said, fine, women can be lifesavers. There were all of the whole cadres across the country of women just ready to go, who already had the skills, already had passed this, sister certification. So he was just an incredible person.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a couple more questions and then we'll move on to the next part of the evening. One of the critiques that I saw, and there was only one, was that you didn't put enough of yourself in the book and how it feels to compete.
Mm.
And I wondered if you might talk about why you made that choice, and also if you just might share something about what it was like to compete or what it is like to compete. You're
Sure.
still doing it.
So for those who haven't read the book, I only appear in the prologue, and I use it as sort of a way to talk about my entry point into this history. So my decision for that was because I really felt like this was a straight up history book, and I didn't see a place for myself in it other than the reason why I got into the story in the first place. So that's why I decided to just limit myself to the prologue. And I talked about the sort of my very initial experience in the sport, how shockingly difficult it was, and how I had to learn to swim without goggles, and it was as I write, just this, it's very difficult without goggles. It's suddenly you become acutely aware of the fact that you can't breathe, even though of course you can't breathe underwater, even if you have on goggles, but it's hard to explain. It just becomes psychologically more difficult. So I tried to talk about that in the prologue, and then to just bring that as a way to talk about the tensions between, is it a sport or is it a performance? Obviously it is a sport, it's very difficult, but there is this performative element, because I was sort of frustrated in my early years. Why can't we wear basic sports equipment, swimming goggles, for this very challenging sport? So, well, the answer is it's not aesthetically pleasing, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the way I sort of brought myself in to set up these tensions that I saw throughout history between performance sport, spectacle, et cetera.
And are you still competing now?
I am, yes. I am with a team called the DC Synchro Masters. So for those who don't know, masters sports are for adult hobbyists who compete. And we're the only team in the DC area, and my teammates range in age from late 20s to late 70s, almost 80, my oldest teammate now. So it's just incredible to do this very intergenerational sport. And it can be as hard as you want it to be, or you can also, there's ways like many sports to make it less physically taxing. You can do slower music as you age. And then you can also just make it incredibly fast, stay upside down longer, do fast music. So there's a little bit of something for everybody within this age range on my team. And
That's awesome.
I love it. I hope I'm still doing it when I'm 80.
Yeah. I saw a picture on Facebook of every member of the U.S. artistic swimming team at this year's Olympics holding a copy of your book. How did that make you feel?
That was incredible. That was truly incredible, because this team this year is actually making history. The U.S. had not qualified to go to the Olympics since 2012, hadn't won a medal in 20 years, an Olympic medal. So, and of course, this was before the Olympics. They hadn't won a medal yet, but they did end up getting a silver medal. So to just see, like, okay, all of this history, and now here's this team that's, made this historic qualification for the Olympics again with my book was really cool. And I actually got to meet them after that. I gave a talk on my book at the National Convention, and they were there, and I got them all to sign a copy of my book. So that's this very special keepsake that I have now, that with all of the Olympic team having signed my book.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one more question for you. I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about how what you learned at Hopkins, if it helped you, be in a place where you could write this book when you were ready to write it. Like, how did your Hopkins experience support the writing of this book and your writing life?
So many ways. I mean, like, I am who I am as a writer because of the Hopkins program. Like, I wouldn't have ever even thought I was somebody who could write a book had I not done that program. And then in just a more tangible way, I mean, just thinking about the techniques of storytelling I learned, I opened every chapter with a vignette, like a small story to kind of draw readers into that chapter before just sort of bombarding them with history. So, I mean, that was a technique I learned in the program. Starting things media res, I learned from Tim's class, starting in the middle of the story, doing, and a lot of my vignettes were that sort of starting in the middle of things. So I just so many, and probably so many things that I can't even think of, because it just completely shaped, every class I had at Hopkins made me a better writer. So, 3 years of that made me into someone who felt like they could take on a book project. So it was completely instrumental in so many ways.
That's awesome. Well, I want to invite you now to do a short reading for us, and then we will get into Q&As from participants.
Okay, sounds good. So since we've already talked about Annette Kellerman, I won't give the little spiel about who she was. But as a quick reminder, she was the vaudeville performer, but that will become evident in this reading. This is about 2 pages, just so you know what you're getting into. It's going to be a perfectly, awfully informal lecture, Annette Kellerman told the 1,300 women who had piled into Broadway's Colonial Theater in November 1909. Kellerman had launched a vaudeville swimming and diving act a few months earlier, and her figure had quickly become the admiration and envy of women across the country who flocked to her public talks, eager to hear her secrets to beauty, health, and happiness. Her methods were so simple and so common sense, she assured the audience, that they were within reach of every society lady or shop girl. Simply eat more fish and vegetables, she preached, wear sensible clothes, and most of all, get out and swim. After all, the ocean was a better beautifier, asserted Kellerman, than any serum produced in any $1,000,000 laboratory or all the beauty specialists on Fifth Avenue. Kellerman, born in 1886 in Sydney, Australia, had barely begun her career, but was already well on her way to becoming one of the most famous women in America. She would build a reputation as a fearless aquatic stuntwoman of the stage and screen, a bold swimwear maverick and a danseuse of the water who is often credited as the mother of synchronized swimming. And as the Victorian era was drawing to a close, Kellerman was precisely the type of role model that American women had been aching for. The ideal 19th century woman had been passive, retiring, and modest, avoiding physical activity or exposure to the elements, and doctors had long warned that exercising feminine minds and bodies would sap them of the vital energy they needed for their higher reproductive callings. But all that was rapidly changing by the turn of the century, and women were taking jobs, going to college, even beginning to agitate for the vote. As this new woman hiked her heavy skirts and entered squarely into more and more male spaces, everyone had an opinion on how all of this would impact women of the future. One article predicted that, quote, woman, grown big mentally, is apt to grow big physically and develop the physical accompaniments of a decisive manner, like a wide mouth, square jawline, and big feet. But Kellerman, the beautiful diving Venus, promised a uniquely aesthetic strength that would upend conceptions of female frailty and challenge the puritanical ideas she believed had, for far too long, held women back. And one of the first steps she would tell her audience is to get rid of those dang corsets, the most ridiculous of all the evils that fashion had perpetrated against women. You can't be brave when you can't breathe, she would declare. Women had been sold the idea that they needed corsets not only to narrow their waists, but also for support. Who, said Kellerman, just do some sit-ups instead. Why should a woman be laced up in steel, she asked, when it is so much more natural and beautiful to be laced up by the tissues of her own well-knit muscles? If the crowd at the Colonial Theater that November looked at Kellerman askance, they couldn't be blamed. After all, a reporter in attendance wrote that she looked like she had been poured into her dress by the most expert of corseteers. But Kellerman assured them, the only bones about me, girls, are the ones nature gave me. Then, to prove it, she pulled off her dress and was left standing on the stage in a tight stockinette bodysuit, her own unique creation for swimming. As the audience giggled and whispered in surprise, she took it a step further, grabbing hold of her swimsuit and ripping it right down the side at her waist. See, she exclaimed, there's nothing underneath but me. And with that, the curtain behind her was opened, revealing a large tank of water and a diving board, which Kellerman promptly climbed onto and began her swimming exhibition, reminding the crowd that this was precisely how she attained her splendid physique. Many a woman went away vowing to learn to swim, wrote the reporter after Kellerman's performance, even if she had to break ice to do it.
Thank you so much. That's such a great moment. I love that. Well, so we're going to open it up to questions from participants. So those of you in the audience can start putting in the chat any questions you have for Vicki about the book, about the writing of the book, about her writing life, about her Hopkins experience, whatever. We have one question I'm going to ask you now. What's your stance on allowing males to compete in synchronized swimming in the Olympics?
Great question. So for those who don't know, men were allowed, so it's right, basically since synchronized swimming became an international sport in the 1950s, then became an Olympic sport in 1984, it was for women only. It was and then it remained a women's only Olympic sport until this Olympics. For the very first time, men were allowed to compete, although there were no male competitors. America has a very famous, excellent male synchronized swimmer named Bill May. He didn't make the cut ultimately. He's in his mid-40s. He came out of retirement to try to get a spot. I think it's great for the sport. My personal stance, and I think the majority of athletes in the sport that I've talked to are definitely completely for having men in the sport. There's really no reason to be keeping anyone out of the sport. You know, it is incredibly dynamic sport. It benefits from having, you know, diversity of body types, different things that different body styles can do. Having men on the team isn't necessarily something that makes a team better or worse. It comes with there are challenges. Men tend to not be as buoyant. But they also bring greater upper body strength. We're talking in generalizations here, of course. So there are pros and cons. You know, I've interviewed Bill May a number of times, and you know, he's talked about the kind of special approach you need to take to choreography to sort of not try to hide a man in the middle of 8 swimmers, but to, you know, use that to an advantage in a routine. So that does take a little bit of work on the part of the choreographer. So, but I'm completely for it. I didn't see any reason to be excluding anyone from the sport in the world we live in today.
Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
How did you narrow your focus transitioning from the research phase into the writing phase? And also, this questioner is wondering how you dealt with the feelings of overwhelm, if you had any during that time.
Oh, I sure did. I definitely felt really overwhelmed by my research. As I mentioned, what was the beginning of that starting to change was getting it into chapters. And that really started when I applied for a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, which I didn't receive, but the process of applying was so beneficial because that got me for the very first time to start to have to lay it out into chapters. So from there, that's what sort of started helping me think about whether something fit in this book or not. Does it fit in any of these themes? And in a couple of cases, actually revising what I thought my chapters would be. As Sue and I were talking about before the event started, like I had actually 2 additional chapters that weren't in my proposal. So in some cases, I thought, well, that wasn't in the proposal, but it should be. So I expanded chapters. So that I think just thinking in these buckets was what helped me narrow down my research. But also my editor helped because I tend to really like to put in direct quotes from, you know, I just found so many fun, colorful quotes that I just had a hard, those were my darlings that I had to slay as a term I learned actually in Sue's class. You know, it's as a writer, it's hard to let things go. And those were the things that were hardest for me because I thought, oh, it was so amazing that I found this thing that this person in 1917 said that's exactly what I'm talking about. So my editor, she just like suggested a lot of those to cut because she said, we believe you. You're a reliable narrator. You don't have to like give us a direct quote from the era every time you make an assertion. So those were the 2 things. How I dealt with feeling overwhelmed, I think that's a good question. I had a lot of support. I have a wonderful support network and my family and my husband. But just, yeah, just trying to use those chapters as a filter, I think is the best way I can think of it. Almost like I tell my students in academic writing, your thesis statement is your filter. Does it go through that funnel or not? So just the chapters became that for me.
And another good question is, I wonder if you can talk about your writing routine. Did you write a certain amount every day? How did you create that structure and discipline for yourself?
I wrote every morning basically get my coffee and start writing. And that was because my work was incredibly understanding. And they said, we understand you've got your brain hours that are going to be best for your writing in the morning. So it's fine if we see you sending emails at 8 or 9 at night. And so I kind of shifted my workday later. I know that's not always possible. I was just incredibly lucky at the time with my supervisor and our director at Georgetown. But no, it was really helpful to kind of discover through the writing process the times that I worked best and maximize those times. So I found definitely through late morning, once I had lunch, it was kind of all over until about late afternoon, I would get another spurt. So I would just kind of structure my work day, which wasn't as mentally taxing, sending emails and things like that to in those in between that mid-afternoon, evening hours. Because again, I mean, it's not ideal to be writing from waking up to going to bed, but I had a year basically to turn around a manuscript. So that's what I was doing for that year.
So would you say you were actually working full time at your job, just different parts of the day, or part-time?
I mean, it's a full-time job, but they were being very flexible with me.
Yeah.
As long as I was getting my work done, they were happy with me and they were fine with me doing that later in the day. So I was incredibly lucky. And I did also teach. I took a break from teaching. I didn't teach for 2 different semesters during this writing and revision process because it was sort of like the only 2 things I could handle was my job and my my book.
Right.
I couldn't sort of separate my brain in another area of thinking for that year.
Right. Of course.
Yeah.
Someone else is wondering if you worked with a writing group or what type of readers you had as you went through the writing process.
So I had a wonderful writing group in my last year at Hopkins that I stayed with for a couple of years. John Trumbo, Christine Grimali, and Doug Kinster, great friends from the program. And Lori Lesser was never an official writing partner, but I would say she's my, we call it essay storming. So we would meet for drinks and talk about writing. And that was always very generative. But once I actually started writing, again, it's just that year that I had to turn around a manuscript was such a crunch year that I wasn't actually able to send it out and get feedback the way I really would have liked. I would have, in an ideal world, I would have written a chapter, sent it to all my wonderful writing network that I have, get feedback, make it better. But I was just desperately trying to get it done. So it wasn't until the manuscript was done that then I sent it to a few trusted friends and asked for feedback. And at that stage, even the changes I could make were more of tightening things up or clarifying things that weren't clear. It was too late to be like, oh, this chapter should be completely rearranged. So I would, if I write a book again in the future, I would hope to have time to do that because I know from being in a writing group and workshopping things at Hopkins how helpful that is. But I just didn't have time to do it the way I would have liked to for this book.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Mhm.
So one person is asking if you told people in your personal life you were working on this book or if you kept it a secret. Did you feel like talking about the book overall was encouraging or discouraging? And if I might add my own question to the end of that, I know that people always want to be, people are very interested in what you're working on, and people always ask, how's the book coming?
Mhm.
And I know for myself that is kind of a question I don't really always want. How was that kind of question for you?
I definitely didn't keep it a secret. Talked about it probably more than people wanted to hear about it. But I think the last part of the question, the year that sort of crunch year, that was tough when people would ask about it because I was often just in this place of feeling like I wasn't getting it done fast enough. So I didn't feel like I was coming from a point of like, oh, it's going great. It was more of like, well, I'm drowning over here. But there was a middle part of that question I feel like I didn't address.
Whether talking about it was encouraging or discouraging?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was encouraging to talk to people about it. One thing that I think was hard was in the period where I was sort of figuring out what's this book about. I never felt I had a good elevator pitch, so I would always just say I'm working on a book on the history of synchronized swimming, and people would be like, nah. Or I'm working on a book on the history of aquatic performance. People would be like, what is that? So I just felt I didn't have a good way to talk about it without just being like, do you have an hour? It was sort of like there wasn't a good shorthand way. But no, so I think the times that people were like, oh, tell me more, and I did tell them more, I felt encouraged because they sounded interested, like, oh, that's going to be an interesting book. So yeah, I found it encouraging for the most part to talk about it.
So that's interesting to hear you say that you had trouble describing it, especially given that you've gotten so much press from such great publications. Like, how do you feel that came together, that the people writing these reviews and articles like could really get it, that there was like a meaty story here?
Yeah, I mean, I give a lot of credit to my publicist, Cleo Hamilton. She was amazing. I just got really lucky. She's the one that my publisher assigned to my book, and we worked really, really well together. I think, Tim Wendell gave me some really valuable advice, which was when you get that author questionnaire, which is, all the information they need to help them, the publisher, sell the book. He was like, take a lot of time. He said a lot of people just do it quickly, but spend a couple of weeks on it. And that was a point at which I really, for one question, for example, was if you had to write 5 different headlines about your book, what would they be? So I tried to, just thinking about those things, because really only the author knows the book well enough to do that. So that was a great exercise in putting that information together, which then the publicists, the marketing people can use when they're telling people about the book and trying to get them to know, hey, it's more than this niche history or whatever. It's yeah. So that I think just thinking through those things, but it's really difficult, you know, those are really hard questions to answer and to come up with, but it's
Yeah.
critical because you're going to need that information over and over, these quick ways to talk about your book.
Another question I had, and I'll just say if there's anyone else out there in the participants who want to ask a few more questions, we probably have room for a couple more, but I wanted to ask you too about timing. It seems like, well, you only had a year to write it, but the timing of it coming out when it did was perfect. Like you couldn't have planned that any better. So how did you feel about that? Like the time crunch was worth it because it came out right in time for the Olympics?
It was I mean, and that is I should have framed that when I was talking about that crunch here. That's the reason it was this just unbending deadline, you know, because it had to be out by the Olympics. So, and I agreed because as I mentioned, you know, 20 minutes ago, the only time people think about the sport is in an Olympic year. And this turned out, you know, this is an interesting sort of lesson to myself. Remember, I said earlier that I was disappointed that I didn't have the book done for the 2020 Olympics, but it turned out to be like the best thing that could have happened because I really wasn't ready. I wasn't done, even though it had been several years, I really wasn't done percolating on it. But the Olympics got postponed, so it would have been a weird year to have an Olympic book come out. But then this year, men were accepted to the sport, so it was in the news for that reason. It was the U.S. got back into the sport for the first time in many Olympiads, so then there's news for that reason. So it just ended up being, you know, I didn't plan it that way. I was thinking I should have been much faster, but you know, things have a way of working out, I guess. But the timing, definitely the publisher and I all agreed it needed to be out by the Olympics. So that's what made that year so tight.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome. Well, I'm so happy for you, and I'm so glad it's been such a success. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about how this journey has been for you, or any lessons for our students who are, you know, early writers or people who want to write books in the future? Like, what can you impart?
I think for me, because I think what made the book process fun, like find what makes it fun. For me, that was the research, and I just really enjoyed the research. So if you find that you find some very niche thing really interesting, but you don't yet know like if there's any value to researching it, I say go for it because you don't know, you know, it's like it could really just grow and grow and grow in your mind as you do research. So I would say like don't be afraid to like pursue your passions, even if you don't know what the outcome will be, even if you don't know yet if there's a story or a book there. Because oftentimes that story just starts to grow as you research it. So that would be one piece of advice. The other was what I said a minute ago, things working out, you know, not being upset with myself for being a slow writer and being a slow researcher and being not as organized as I would have liked, and that all making the book take longer, but then it worked out in a really great way that it came out when it did. So to not, you know, don't be discouraged if you're not getting things done as fast as you would like. There's a lot of value to like slow cooking on something, you know, and thinking about it for a long time, and it'll ultimately make the product really different and probably better if you have more time to think on it.
Those are great pieces of advice. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Sue. This was so fun, especially to be with my former thesis advisor and teacher. And
Well, it was a great joy for me too, and I really appreciate all the people that joined in tonight. Thank you so much, and I think we're coming to our close. So
thank you everyone who came and for the great questions.